Our next speaker will be Dr. Maria Lorena Santos, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Philippines in Metro Manila. We believe this may be the first JASNA conference at which we've had a speaker from the Philippines, so it's an historical moment. Laurie, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Bob. I shall just share my screen. All right, can everyone see this? All right, I'll begin. So hello, Jane Austen enthusiasts, fellow Jane Austen enthusiasts and academics. Greetings from the Philippines and many thanks for this invitation to join you in a conversation about Jane Austen in the Pan-Pacific. When I was asked to provide my title for this talk, I gave this very general one you see here, Jane Austen in the Philippines, thinking that I would later refine this when I had found more local Austen adaptations. As I began writing, however, I realized that there has not yet been a study of Jane Austen's presence in my home country. Even as a Filipino scholar interested in the gender politics in Austen adaptations, I chose back in 2008 to work on US and UK published retellings and sequels, for the very practical reason that I could not, at the time, find any Filipino adaptations or even translations of Austen. I also did not think about contextualizing her within a Philippine readership. One reason for the absence of Filipino Austens, perhaps, is that the language in her novels is not as easily accessed by many Filipinos. Sources may say that English is widely used in the country, and this may be the case for second language speakers of English. But a much smaller percentage of Filipinos use English as a first language. And this is the group more likely to consume English language texts. An even smaller percentage would consume works labeled in the Philippines as Anglo-American classics. Within the last decade, however, I heard of a few Austen-related publications which emerged mainly through the venues of online publishing. So for this year's conference, I began my hunt for Filipino Austens, transforming my very general title into the following preliminary questions. Is there a Philippine Jane Austen? Does she have a presence in the Philippines? And if so, what kind of presence? The search led to several more Austen-based local texts, and more importantly, patterns of preoccupations and prejudices, which provide insights into how Austen is transformed for Filipino audiences. My early foray into these texts has already yielded some findings regarding the gendered anxieties and desires that emerge from texts produced within my country's particular post-colonial context. There is no need to emphasize that Jane Austen remains popular and adaptable to different media, times, and cultures, including those in Asia, and some of these texts have been were mentioned earlier. Yet in her survey of the editions of Austen's novels, Margaret Sullivan describes Asian translations as latecomers, with the earliest appearing in China at the turn of the 20th century. While in contrast, translations of Austen into European languages have been around since the 1800s. One of Sullivan's claims is that Austen's novels are not merely in English, they are English. As a result, British society as a national character, which propels so many of her heroines into their tribulations, has been trickier to translate than the author's words. I think that there are other more complex and nuanced reasons to explore, and that more explanations can be found in studies of specific works from Asian contexts, especially post-colonial ones. While my dissertation research led me to about 200 Austen-related spin-offs published since the 1990s, I found far fewer translations and adaptations from Asia. I was not familiar with many of the texts listed by Sullivan and other researchers, and a more recent search in just the past few weeks has shown me that there are new texts that need to be added to supplement these earlier surveys. But I can at least begin to speculate about why there are so few Filipino adaptations, as I look closely at each one. I'll state the caveat, however, that my research on Austen's reception in the Philippines is ongoing, and my findings are still preliminary ones. I began by asking what kind of presence Jane Austen has in the Philippine classroom. In 1898, the English language arrived along with American colonial rule in the Philippines. English, says Isabel Pefianco Martin, was promoted as a language that would civilize the Filipinos. The educational policy that was established included the heavy use of Anglo-American instructional materials and literature for language instruction, as a way of confining the native languages outside the territories of formal schooling. Throughout 4 decades of American public education, Filipino students were exposed to what Martin refers to as the canon of the colonial classroom, a list in which Austen's name does not appear. Unlike Austen, Shakespeare is clearly present in the Philippines, with appropriations into local forms and languages, and even a Manila Shakespeare Company. After all, it wasn't until the early 20th century that Austen's works became more firmly entrenched in American academia, which meant that it would have taken more time for her to reach Philippine shores by way of the classroom. Besides this, the early American response to Austen was not that favorable. Southam, for instance, noted that she was deemed not democratic enough for American tastes. This is significant because the Anglo-American texts taught in the Philippines were chosen based on how they would best serve the interests of the colonizers, those that, as Martin asserts, promoted myths about colonial realities. In a 2007 study, also by Martin, titled "The Literature Filipino Students Do Not Read," Austen is not part of the top 10 required readings listed by survey respondents in Philippine high schools. Shakespeare's there. Neither is she in the top 10 list of texts that high school students choose to read on their own. Interestingly, on each of the top 10 lists, there is only one woman. So Austen's absence may also be attributed to the fact that male writers continue to predominate in many literature textbooks and curricula in the Philippines. A look at the Philippines Department of Education website reveals that Austen is not required reading in high school, although her name appears as one of the optional authors in a long list of senior high school English creative writing, the creative writing course. It does appear on some college literature reading lists, at least in my university. I have taught her works in a general education Intro to Lit course, as part of a British literature survey course, in an Anglo-American women's writing course, and in a special topics course on popular romance. My English majors are often already familiar with Pride and Prejudice, either from having read it as one of the classics of Anglo-American literature, or from having watched at least one screen adaptation of it. More recently, my students tend to cite the 2005 version with Keira Knightley, or the 2012 transmedia retelling, The Lizzie Bennet Diaries. Another area for future study has to do with Filipino readers of Austen, or Austen reception in the Philippines. One sign that she is read here is that her novels are sold not only in mainstream bookstores, but in many bargain bookstalls around Metro Manila and other cities. Local newspapers have featured articles about Austen when Pride and Prejudice turned 200 years old. Reader discussions on the blog of local bookstore Fully Booked, as you see here, have included mentions of her work, and one post focused solely on the Austen encounters of its Filipino readers. There is also an online jewelry shop called Obstinate Headstrong Girls, established in 2011 by 2 Filipino sisters who describe themselves as avid Jane Austen fans. They chose the name as a playful homage to Elizabeth Bennet, whom they celebrate for refusing to bend to mere convention and expectation, and for exhibiting the admirable tendency to think for oneself. I take this from their site. Also likely to be readers of Austen are the members of local romance reader communities, since Austen's novels, especially Pride and Prejudice, are credited with having influenced popular romance genres like Regency romances and even works like Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey. In 2013, a Filipino romance group called #RomanceClass was established after a writing workshop brought together readers of popular romance in English, who began to write and publish their own romances via online publishing platforms. These writers declare themselves to be influenced by the Anglo-American canon and Western rather than local Tagalog romances. One of the members of this group penned a Pride and Prejudice retelling that I will talk about today. While I limit my discussion to just 3 novels, there are other works that have emerged within roughly the last decade, taking off perhaps from the global Austen mania of the late 90s and 2000s, the rise of ebooks and online publishing, and the growth of organized romance reader communities in the Philippines. There are, for example, 2 translations into the Filipino language of Pride and Prejudice and Emma, both published by Sunflower Press in 2020 and 2019, respectively. But these are, ironically, currently unavailable to me in my region. There is also the start of what may someday be a graphic novel version in the Twitter posts of a Filipino-Chinese animation student who sketched Elizabeth and Darcy dancing the traditional cariñosa, as you can see here, with some commentary about the sexual tension innate to the dance. She also sketched other Filipinized scenes of Pride and Prejudice, including an imagined harana or courtship serenade scene, okay, and a translation of the rejection scene from Pride and Prejudice, the rejection of Darcy. Another work is a 2-volume Tagalog romance called Petals and Chocolates, published in 2007 by Precious Pages Corporation, whose mass market books are read by millions of Filipinos. While there is no explicitly mentioned connection to Pride and Prejudice here, the plot is recognizable. The poor heroine meets and later falls in love with a wealthy hero who hates her family. Taking this work into account, one could also argue that the elements of at least Austen's Pride and Prejudice have appeared in many Filipino romantic comedies and sitcoms. Hate at first sight, a bantering couple, class differences as an obstacle, and so on. But these texts, with only an incidental connection to Austen, offer material for another study. I will now discuss 3 Austen adaptations from the Philippines. All are English language texts and modernized spin-offs of Pride and Prejudice, made available via online self-publishing platforms like Amazon and Wattpad. Rather than focusing now on class difference, which is framed as an obstacle in only one of the novels, I will examine instead 3 central preoccupations that cut across these texts. I'm interested in the prejudices, both in Austen's and in the more contemporary sense, that emerge from these romance-focused transpositions of Pride and Prejudice to the contemporary Philippine context. The first text is a romance novel titled Matilda and William by D.P. Nugid, with no references to specific locations in the Philippines, but with characters speaking Philippine English and conversing about cultural and social issues relevant in the country. The second, Well Played by Katrina Ramos Atienza, a member of #Romance Class, is a chick lit retelling set in a regional campus of the University of the Philippines. And the third, If You Want to Be Happy by Raisa Rivera Falgi, is a young adult romance which, while not strictly a retelling, is tagged on Wattpad as a P&P novel and has characters who explicitly refer to the source text. What is striking about these spin-offs is their attention to 3 interconnected issues. First, notions of beauty and whiteness in the Philippines. Second, the repression and expression of female desire. And third, negotiations of female identity in a society where traditional values and modern ones are in conflict. Pamela Regis, who devotes a chapter to Pride and Prejudice in her tracing of the romance novel's history and form, says that the barriers in a romance novel highlight what is at stake. For P&P, she says, it is the nature of marriage itself. The barriers pose the question, on what basis should marriage go forward? These Filipino Austens pose a similar question for Filipino readers. What is the basis in the Philippines today of a successful relationship like that of Elizabeth and Darcy? Regis lists multiple barriers to the many courtships in Pride and Prejudice, but I'll mention in the form of a long list of characters those barriers that apply to just Darcy and Elizabeth's union. These are Caroline Bingley, Mr. Bennet, Wickham, Lady Catherine, Mr. Bennet, Darcy himself, and Elizabeth herself. The latter two representing internal barriers of Pride and Prejudice, which are the largest and the last to fall. It is these barriers and the preoccupations related to them that I focus on in the three retellings of Pride and Prejudice by Filipino writers. The first has to do with the female characters' insecurities regarding their looks. Taking off perhaps from Darcy's first impression of Elizabeth as tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt him, none of the local Elizabeths are described as great beauties. But what is interesting is that in at least two of these books, the main character's complexion and Filipino features are repeatedly remarked upon. Of the three spin-offs, Matilda and William is the most obsessed with skin color as a marker of beauty. In the book's first chapter, the Elizabeth character Matilda, or Mattie Cruz, is contrasted with her older sister Janice, whose beauty is more than once described in connection with the whiteness of her skin and her legs. Mattie, meanwhile, who was a varsity swimmer in college and who still swims regularly for exercise, is brown-skinned, and more disturbingly, is described by her mother as not very pretty due to her darker skin. Unlike her sisters, who use whitening products, Mattie does not care about her complexion. But after she meets William, the Darcy of the novel, she tries Janice's whitening cream to lighten her tan, obsesses about its effects, and later even buys her own beauty products. The middle sister, Alicia, the novel's Mary Bennet, is also described as ugly and is presumably dark-skinned as well, because she is advised by her younger sisters to use whitening papaya soap. Her completely logical response to their advice, however, is framed as pedantic and pretentious. She says, "I have no use for devices which perpetuate the colonial mentality of Filipinos. White skin does not necessarily mean beauty." But even Mattie mocks and dismisses Alicia's statement, suggesting that it has no substance. The first chapter of another spin-off, If You Want to Be Happy, is titled No Beauty, a reference to Caroline Bingley's litany of criticisms against Elizabeth. The blurb for the novel describes the main character, Benita Moran, nicknamed Bennett, as small and brown with a flat Filipino nose. Her appearance is a source of insecurity for Bennett, who thinks of herself as someone no boy would be interested in. Her mother tells her, if you want to be happy, don't focus on your looks. And her parents preach that being good is more important than being beautiful. But Bennett can't help comparing herself to her pretty older sister, described as fair, of course, with fairly straight hair. When her Filipino-American cousin assures Bennett that her Filipino features are cute, Bennett says to herself, clearly she has not observed the colonial mentality among Filipinos, especially the men who prefer the mestiza girls, the ones with fair skin and straight, well-defined noses. There is more of an attempt to counter this colonial thinking, or the equating of whiteness with beauty in this novel. For one thing, Connor, the American boy that Bennett meets and falls for when she goes to California, is similarly insecure about his appearance. He's described as short and red-haired, possibly descended from leprechauns, with almost every attractive girl towering over him. For another, Jenna, the Caroline Bingley character, is made even more villainous when she not only taunts Bennett during a lesson on Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, the one that begins with, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun," but also makes a racist remark about Bennett's very presence. She says, "As if there aren't enough people of every kind of color in our school." The third novel, Well Played, is far less preoccupied with notions of beauty, and its main character is confident and secure. The book nonetheless makes mention of her skin color. Patrice Reyes, a communications major, is also a varsity soccer player, so she is tan. This is remarked upon only by a Mrs. Bennet analog, Mrs. Timbol, who says that she would have not met her husband if she had wandered around the campus looking like a refugee or a sweaty tomboy, all dark from the sun and eating like a construction worker. Patrice affectionately dismisses this, But it's interesting that Mrs. Timball's remarks are utilized in the novel to contrast Patrice's slightly lower level of attractiveness with the more obvious prettiness of her best friend and roommate, Gia, the Jane Bennet character. Another roommate, Deanie, who represents Lydia Bennet, is described as a new freshman with an upturned nose. In these courtship plots, such Filipino features are perceived as barriers only by the heroines, and only two of the heroines, although all three novels mention skin color. The Darcy analogs find each heroine attractive, and when they do remark on her complexion, it is to admire this. As golden, warm, delectable milky mocha. These reassurances, akin to Darcy's admiration of the brilliancy which exercise gave to Elizabeth's complexion, could be a way of directing readers to acknowledging and correcting the colonial legacy of white worship. The second preoccupation has to do with the traits of a desirable partner, since in Pride and Prejudice, the many courtships, couples, and marriages allow readers to reflect on the qualities of both men and women, which can form the basis of a good marriage. While much can be said about the male characters in these three novels, I will focus, due to time constraints, only on descriptions of female characters. Because so many contemporary readers regard Elizabeth Bennet, despite her flaws, as an ideal heroine, it's interesting to see how the Filipino Elizabeth's qualities are represented, especially when set against the analogs of other female characters in Pride and Prejudice. In these three Filipino Austens, such contrasts often center around social and cultural beliefs regarding female desire and sexuality in the Philippines. Two of the novels, as college and high school romances, are chaste romances, meaning that the hero and heroine do not sleep with each other. However, the working characters Mattie, in her mid-20s, and William, who is 30, enter a relationship and have sex. This is particularly interesting because Philippine romance writers have spoken about the challenges of writing about sex for Filipino readers. The Philippines, after all, is still a patriarchal society, and a predominantly Catholic one, in which female virginity is prized and premarital sex is frowned upon. During a discussion about marriage, for example, Mattie's sister Alicia lectures the family, saying, according to the teachings of the church, one of the reasons for marrying is to prevent fornication. It is still best if we can remain chaste. It is even better to remain a virgin. The novel directly questions this when Mattie and Janice choose to sleep with the men they love. But Mattie, along with the readers who identify with her, still has to negotiate her feelings about this. At first, she's apprehensive. She waits anxiously for William to ask her to be his girlfriend because, quote unquote, that was how she knew romantic relationships were formed. This internal conflict, as well as other plot elements involving sex, allow contraception to be discussed. The sisters remark on the availability of condoms at local drugstores, and Mattie asserts that even in the heat of the moment, one can still have safe sex. She says this after the discovery that her youngest sister, 18-year-old Monique, has become pregnant. So this is the Lydia Bennet character. But unlike in Pride and Prejudice, where the potential scandal becomes an external barrier to Darcy and Elizabeth's union, Monique's pregnancy instead reinforces the internal barrier of Mattie's insecurity by making her question whether William is just using her for sex. Later, this barrier is filled when Mattie realizes that what she has heard and believed about sex while growing up, about how it is bad and should be engaged in only in the context of marriage, no longer applies. Even at the point when her relationship status is not secure, Mattie admits to herself that she has no regrets about sleeping with William. Similarly, Well Played seems to be negotiating sex in terms of female freedom in a contemporary yet still patriarchal Philippine context. Again, this is done via the contrast between the Elizabeth and Lydia characters. At a college party in which, for the second time, Patrice runs into Paul Dalmasio, the Darcy, whom she thinks of as snooty and rude, she intentionally dances wildly, intending to horrify him with her behavior. Patrice and her other female friends enjoy many freedoms in their modern university. They let themselves go, I'm quoting now, at parties. They drink and dance with abandon. However, they must still control their bodies to avoid peer censure. Or worse, the physical attention of men like Lars, a sexual predator and the Wickham analog in this text. Lars tells Patrice lies about Paul being violent towards women, when it is he who is guilty of sexual assault. He then spreads rumors around the school that he and Patrice have been, quote unquote, pretty hot and heavy with each other. Both Patrice and Paul are exonerated, but Dini, remember the Lydia character, who does not police her body, suffers a worse fate when she stays out all night with Lars. The novel disturbingly suggests that unlike Patrice, who doesn't care much about her appearance and dresses dowdily in jeans and t-shirts or in her soccer uniform, Dini may have been headed for trouble based on her clothing and behavior. So there's a bit of slut shaming and victim blaming here. She sashayed in a tiny black skirt, halter top, black tights, and high wedge sandals. She sat cross-legged on the floor, oblivious to the tiny shorts riding up her crotch. She came bounding out the door in a tank top and a flouncy miniskirt. Dini's escapade with Lars leads her mother to pull her out of the university with the intention of transferring her to a new school. I quote from the book, preferably run by nuns where there are no boys or sororities or raging parties to distract her from her studying. Dini's narrative ends with Mrs. Timball's glib remark that not everyone is cut out for the university and its freedoms. Sexual freedom and desire are perhaps most openly talked about in If You Want to Be Happy, which features the youngest couple. Both Bennett and Connor are virgins, but they talk openly about sex and even discuss the importance of consent in their conversations about film and literature. 17-year-old Bennett explores the sexual attraction she feels for Connor and questions social norms about sex in both the Philippine and American context. When someone compares her to Maria Clara, a well-known character from a Filipino novel, she asserts that she is not like her, sweet, virginal, meek, self-sacrificing. Maria Clara, as Bennett tells Connor, is the model for Filipino women of the 19th century, and for many, still the ideal to aspire to. Bennett rejects the comparison, realizing how passive and tragic the figure seems to be. In contrast, Bennett decides her own fate. When she and Connor come close to having sex, her Catholic upbringing and her need to be a good girl for her parents make her stop because she says she does not feel right about doing this. Connor listens to her, and the two end up discussing their religious beliefs. Later, when the relationship has been somewhat tested, and because she will soon return to the Philippines, Bennett offers to give Connor what he wants, but he stops her, saying that when they sleep together, it should be for both of them. When Bennett leaves, there is still a gulf between the two, which Bennett identifies as not race, nationality, culture, or religion, but rather their attitudes towards the future. She realizes that Connor's impatience to sleep with her wasn't so much about lust or hungering for the experience as fear that they might lose their chance. In the final chapter, this gulf is bridged because Connor no longer feels the future is uncertain, and he acts on firm plans to be with Bennett. He actually transfers to her Philippine university. What kind of sexual freedom is negotiated for these Filipino Elizabeths? On the one hand, they are no longer constrained by traditional beliefs about chastity and virginity. They question these and are comfortable with their bodies and with sensual or sexual experiences. Mattie resolves her conflicts about sleeping with William. Bennett negotiates with her partner regarding what she is ready for. And Patrice moves, plays, and dances with seeming freedom and abandon. On the other hand, restrictions remain in the form of social and self-policing. Women who are not careful, the books suggest, come to a bad end. The bad females, quote unquote bad, the Lydias and even Caroline Bingleys are punished in these retellings. Monique is abandoned by her boyfriend and is saved from a dismal future only because she has a miscarriage. Dini is banished from the university for being undeserving of its freedoms. And the spiteful Jenna, who, I'm quoting from the book, defiantly violates the school's dress code with her tight and revealing tops, is suspended and banned from attending the prom. While the books seem to be expanding the meaning of what a good and desirable heroine is by allowing her greater sexual freedom, there are still lines which Filipino females cannot cross, and these female transgressors face dire consequences. Right. I will use the third preoccupation to reach my conclusion and wrap up this discussion. I argue that all three spin-offs use Pride and Prejudice to explore female identity within a setting that is post-colonial but not decolonized. The modern characters Mattie, Patrice, and Bennett assert new freedoms and identities in a space where modern gender roles are associated with Western or American culture. At the same time, as Filipinos, they are not always comfortable with the values brought by the colonialism of the past and the cultural imperialism of the present. The fraught relationship between the US and the Philippines, and reflected in these texts, explains the first two preoccupations. On the one hand, there is the desire to be rid of problematic mentalities that pervade the minds of modern Filipinos, such as the association of beauty with whiteness and Caucasian features. When Bennett of If You Want to Be Happy visits Disneyland with her new American friends, urge her to pose with the figure of Moana, whom they say she resembles. But Connor admits he's never seen the film and says he doesn't think of it as a popular movie in the US. Bennett tells him that it was a big hit in the Philippines, not just because of Moana's Filipino-like appearance, but because the film featured a heroine with a history and culture like that of pre-colonial Philippines. Colonial mentality is also rejected in Matilda and William via mockery made of the Mr. Collins character. Here he is Jojo, the neighbor's pompous son, who has returned after making his fortune in the US, and whose ridiculous mother eats only US chocolates and declares Filipino varieties to be fake. Finally, one of the most frequently mentioned locations in Well Played is a party venue called the University Students' Apartments. So interestingly, USA for short. It is notably described as an unsupervised wonderland where the nights rang out with the sound of drinking. And it is here where both Patrice and Deanie fall prey to Lars. On the other hand, the US also represents freedom from confining views about gender. There's a lot of discourse in Matilda and William about women working. And Mattie, a literature teacher, dreams of going to America to earn her doctoral degree. To her, this offers the only available escape from the oppressive parental authority of her mother and the cultural obligations of having to sacrifice her income to pay for the education of her younger siblings, because that's how it works here. Next, Bennett's trip to California provides her with the research and experiences she needs to pursue her interests in film and screenwriting. Interestingly, it is when she leaves home that she becomes most comfortable with herself and her Filipino looks. Finally, Patrice also feels comfortable and incredibly free when she leaves the confines of her boarding house and parties in the USA. In fact, when she and Gia let themselves go by dancing to the music, she notes how, and I quote from the book, it was as if a primal scream were released from the center of their beings, and giving into the yell freed some integral part of themselves that spent most of its time trapped and hidden. These conflicting desires can explain the sometimes confused and dated representations of gender roles and behavior. For example, there's the mention of revealing clothing and dress codes in Well Played and If You Want to Be Happy, and the description of Janice in Matilda and William as attractive because she is, quote unquote, simple, which in the Philippines means easy to get along with, down to earth, not fastidious. All the women excel in their chosen fields. Some of these traditionally male-dominated ones, like swimming, soccer, and filmmaking. But some stereotypes regarding gender and profession remain. All of the Elizabeths are in arts and humanities fields, while all the Darcys are in science, technology, and engineering. Moreover, as romance-oriented texts, all three books conclude with a satisfying end for the readers, the barriers spelled, and the couples united. For my own conclusion, a tentative one, until I can study these texts further, I will answer a variant of my opening question. What kind of presence does Jane Austen have in these three Filipino texts that converse with Pride and Prejudice? It seems to me as if these Filipino romances use Austen to present heroines with the agency and freedom to at the very least question local beliefs that constrain women. The felling of the internal barriers of their anxieties rewards the heroines with loving and equal partnerships, like that of Elizabeth and Darcy. At the same time, the fact that Pride and Prejudice is British rather than an American import, ironic because the US was formerly a British colony, allows them the space to critique the colonial legacy in the Philippines. It seems then, and bear with me, I could not resist this, it seems then that the truth universally acknowledged by these Filipino texts is that a single woman in possession of self-knowledge in the post-colonial but not decolonized and still patriarchal Philippines will not be in want of a happy ending. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lori. That was fantastic. We have a couple of questions. Oh, if you could stop sharing your screen so we can see you better.
All right.
So the first question is, the patriarchal society being described, that you described sounds very similar to the society in Austen's time, but modern women can work and go to college, they're educated. Do you see analogs in these novels that you've talked about with some of Austen's very few female working characters like Mrs. Reynolds and Mrs. Hill in Pride and Prejudice?
I haven't really looked into many of the other female characters. I've focused mainly on the Elizabeth analogs, and they tend to be younger in these narratives. But I would say that there is an exploration of that. I'm thinking, for instance, of how in Well Played, the main characters' friendships are fully explored. Like you don't just get a Charlotte, you get several female friends from different organizations, and some of them are heads and presidents of these organizations. And she's part of a female soccer team. So in that regard, so I don't know about the area of economics yet and finances, but in that regard, yeah, women pursuing careers, that's something that is explored in these texts.
It's very interesting about the arts and humanities versus the sciences and technology. Another question is, the themes in Austen's novels of economics, gender, class, marriage seem to be very Filipino issues as well. This is from Joy. She's wondering, are there any films in the Filipino movie industry that come close to a Jane Austen adaptation?
Right, a great question. Actually, I was so surprised. I'm actually baffled as to why there are no explicit film adaptations of Austen in the Philippines. Well, there is at least one of a Bronte novel, now Wuthering Heights. There's a Filipino version of that. So one would think that with all these elements resonating with Filipino audiences, that there would be an adaptation. So my answer to that is as far as I know, there are no explicit adaptations. But I would argue, and I mentioned this very briefly in the talk as a gesture towards future studies, that if you look at Filipino rom-coms, if you look at Filipino films, anything involving these romances and class differences, there are so many elements of it present. Okay, so very popular. For instance, I have a student who wrote a paper connecting a very popular Wattpad novel called She's Dating a Gangster. And she cited connections between the first encounter of Darcy and Elizabeth. That sort of, sometimes they call it a meet cute, okay, though this might be the opposite. That the what do you call this? His seeming rejection of her at first. So we can actually see a lot of those I see a lot of those in local texts, where hero and heroine don't seem to get along at first. And then they banter, they fight, okay, they argue. And that seems to be, because it's a recurring feature, that seems to be one of the points, the aspects of Austen that appeals to Filipino audiences.
Terrific. I think we're out of time, and those are the main questions. Thank you so much, Lori. It was just wonderful, so enlightening, and really, I think you gave us all a lot of material that we're going to want to hunt down and read. So thank you.
Thank you.
And so we will be back at 5 minutes till the hour, or let's say 4 minutes to the hour. Okay, thanks everybody.